Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the third and last day of the Conversations program. My name is Colleen Milliard. I've been your host for the last 3 days. And yesterday we talked about the future of the art world. Today we're going to talk about a future which is much nearer. We're talking about next May, when the Venice Biennale will open in Venice, Italy. Now, Venice is often compared to the Olympics of the art world, and what that means is that each country sends their champion to represent them in Venice on that global stage. And we are very, very lucky today because we have one such champion among us, the artist Sung Tieu, who is representing Germany. Sung Tieu is representing Germany, not alone, with the artist Henrike Naumann, and together they're really going to take this incredible pavilion at the top of the Giardini and present their project. Now, you probably don't know this, but there's a rule about Venice. It's a bit like the Fight Club. You can't talk about Venice. At least you can't talk about the project. So we will not be able to reveal all the details of what Sung Tieu and Henrike are planning for the Venice Biennale. However, we're going to take this opportunity to take a deep dive into this incredible practice that Sung Tieu you've developed over many years. You're in conversation with Gitte Zschoch, who is the General Secretary at the Institute for Foreign Cultural Affairs in Stuttgart and Berlin. And I also want to thank the German General Consulate here in Miami Beach, our partners in crime, for this conversation. So thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming again Sung and Gitte to the conversation stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome everyone. We are very honored to be invited to this talk, thanks to the Foreign Office and of Germany. In today's conversation, we want to delve into Sung Tieu's work, look at the number of bodies of work of hers that you can also see at the presentation and in the images behind us, talk about key topics in her artistic approach, and share an outlook on her presentation at the German Pavilion in Venice in 2026. Sung Tieu is an artist who lives and works in Berlin. She was born in 1987 in Hai Son in Vietnam and moved to Germany at the age of 5 in 1992. She studied art in Hamburg at Goldsmiths College and the Royal Academy of Arts in London. And having grown up between two political systems, Tieu's work unfolds at the intersections of biography and geopolitics. In her practice, she uses installations that unfold in space, and she uses sculpture, found objects, sound, video, photography, text, and archival material. In the US, she has shown her work at the MIT List Visual Arts Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at Armand in New York. Other international engagements include the biennials in Taipei, Taiwan, Gwangju in South Korea, Shanghai, and Sao Paulo. Currently, her work is at display in Bern, Switzerland. And now we're very lucky to be here in Miami today. My name is Gitte Zschoch. I'm the Secretary General of IFA, German's Institute for Foreign Relations. Through art, we create trust and understanding between people worldwide, and we promote art also on an international stage, art from Germany. We produce the artworks that are represented at the Venice Biennale. And to start, Sung, we see your work behind us. There's a tendency to colors black, white, maybe brown. And we've also seen what is at display here at Art Basel Miami Beach. What is your impression of what you've seen here at the fair? And how do you approach art, like on this visual level?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I think I'm sort of a conceptual artist, and I think perhaps the composition of colors is not necessarily the first thing that comes into my mind when I think about making work. So the way I oftentimes start making exhibitions is to think about the certain different contexts I operate in and I work in. We're currently looking at images from the KW show from February earlier this year, where I sort of looked into, for one, the institutional structures of KW itself as a in Germany we would call it Kunstverein, something like a non-collecting institution. And I make a key work in that exhibition where I sort of, not necessarily criticize, but I wanted to sort of like reform the board by actually adding a member to the board through the sale of an artwork. And so I think a lot about, institutional conditions. And for the KW show, for instance, that was titled 1995, 2025, 1992, 2025. I look at basically these 2 years and how they collide. And so depending on where the exhibition happens, it takes on a very different approach.
So now you've described, how you that your work is very process-based, and that you also look at structures and how power dynamics interact in structures of the art world. And then how do you arrive at your visual choices?
I think that's kind of difficult to say as an artist, because I think I'm naturally drawn to certain materials. One feature in my work is steel, and actually I only found out very recently, because I'm not in great contact with my father, but that he worked in a steel factory in Freital by Dresden when I was 5, and I think it just subconsciously must somehow have registered, and strangely it has surfaced in my work a lot. But it's not so much that I go out there and I seek a certain outcome in the way the exhibition looks. It's a process that I go through, and I ask, what the exhibition needs, and through that certain forms arrive. So, for instance, in the KW show, one of the key images that I found in the archive was a cigarette, 2 cigarette boxes hidden in a book that I found in the archive, the GDR archive, where you had a GDR citizen trying to smuggle American cigarettes through the border into the GDR, which was at the time not allowed because, it was sort of like the capitalist West, and you weren't allowed to smoke Marlboro cigarettes in the GDR. And that key image, became a leading thread throughout the show. And I sort of weave it back into the history of, quote unquote, cigarette smuggling. We would call that the Vietnamese community sort of did in the 90s, when they lost all their jobs after the collapse of the GDR and were left in a legal gray zone where they had no means to rightfully work. They had no permit to work, and they resorted to selling basically, self-imported cigarettes, mostly from, Eastern Europe, to then sell them in Germany. So, I think about history, and I think about how certain things are interconnected, and then I find certain references that, in that moment in time make sense to me, and then I use that to come to a certain visual language that, of course, grows out of the history of conceptual art, a history of what you might call, sometimes I use the language of minimalism, or, but yeah, I sort of pick and choose when it works with certain things that I want to express.
Now, you've already mentioned, I think, 2 topics that inform several bodies of your work, and that is Vietnamese history, and that's also the history of the GDR. Can you tell us more about that? How does your background as having or being born in Vietnam, having no German parents, Vietnamese parents, but having spent most of your life, the dominant part of your life in Germany, how that informs your work?
I think I feel sort of ambivalent about that. On the one hand, I have a body of work that very much deals with my biography, and then I have entire different body of work that doesn't deal with that at all. It's a strange schizophrenic, existence, because on the one hand, I'm very drawn to unpacking, the conditions that brought me to Germany. I think for one, because I had no choice. When I was 5 and my mother decided that this was was going to be my life, because she actually didn't even tell me that we would move. It was basically a choice from one day to another, where she just said, look, we're going to go. And that very significant moment in my life is something that I'm, consciously or subconsciously very interested in exploring. And then, of course, I'm also resisting that because obviously as a German Vietnamese artist, you can very much also get trapped into your own, sort of self-identification with your own work, and feeling the need to have to serve that, or to constantly present that to your audience. And so I feel very ambivalent about that. And yet I have a body of work that looks very closely into that, but actually it looks more closely into how Germans look at the Vietnamese. Not so much what I think or what I feel, but rather the other way around, is what is the gaze of the government, of state protocols, of administrative processes that have shed light on that population that my father and later on me were part of. So,
what would be one of the insights that you have on that? Like, how does the German public or government authorities look at Vietnamese people? What are some findings that surprised you, or that you want to share with the audience?
Of course, like every sample that you take has its, preconditions. But one things that I looked at were state archives of how, contract workers were registered, how, for instance, flights were booked for contract workers to come to Germany, how they would basically classify, different sets of populations to go to work in different factories. So I look at, administrative processes, and I try to understand how those administrative processes looked at, human beings. So one of the key documents that I found during my research in 2021 was a flight list, where the document would list exactly, the flight number, the ministry, and the amount of people that would fly on that day, and they would keep record of how many people arrived in Germany, where they would go, and what would happen to them. And I became very much interested in those state documentations, and how, of course, different behaviors by humans were then classified as, by the Stasi also as quote-unquote dangerous or quote-unquote suspicious. That could mean, for instance, having a relationship with a German. It could mean you not showing up to work on time. It could mean anything that was out of the ordinary. So, I became interested in that, and those then again featured in some of the exhibitions.
So when you talk about Germany, you talk about the GDR, right? And the Stasi that you mentioned is the secret police of East Germany at the time. And I find it very interesting that you say Germany, and you need special knowledge about the history of Germany to know what part of Germany you refer to. And I also find it interesting, and I understand that you're ambivalent about that you're seen as an artist who deals with Vietnamese German history or German history, and that not all of your work is about that. And I would say, when I looked at your work with those glasses on, of course I saw it a lot, this research or this practice that looked at these historical references. And yet I would also say that in German art history, very few artists look at the Vietnamese German or East German GDR history. And so I find it very important that someone sheds light also on the contract workers that your father was a part of, that you described. Is that something that you also consciously do, trying to change the views of maybe mainstream German publics on this part of history?
I think so. I mean, I think I'm interested in perception, and I think oftentimes, that history of contract work to the GDR was neglected. I've been doing work about that since 2014, and only maybe the last 5 years there have been museums picking up that topic, from Haus der Kulturen der Welt to Albertinum, and that's actually a recent tendency. And for me, it was more about also contextualizing, or even make people understand why those Vietnamese people are in Germany today. It's such a basic thing to say, but I think many have not fully, registered that once, of course, in the GDR, those people were welcome and were needed for the GDR economy. And why I talk about Germany and not necessarily about the GDR is that I think, a lot of these processes, count across actually, West Germany, GDR, and the Federal Republic that we're talking about. And in the case of the Vietnamese contract workers, I would argue that they were left behind by 3 countries, by the GDR, by the reunited Germany, and by Vietnam. And no one necessarily felt responsible for them, which then created this legal, bubble and legal gray zone where they would exist in.
So today's panel was announced as, shaping Germany's Venice Biennale in 2026. When you heard that you were one of the chosen artists to represent Germany at the German Pavilion in Venice 2026, what was your reaction?
That's a... I don't really know, to be honest. I think, of course, I have certain feelings about that as an artist, what it means to, do the Venice Biennale and to show your work in such a prominent space. That is, of course, a very loaded space. I think for me, as sort of a person with no German heritage, I'm a born Vietnamese, my parents are Vietnamese. I think it's a special situation. It's of course not the first time that this is happening, but I think it's a special situation to think about that and to think about what my cultural contribution could be for such a situation.
What I've, well, maybe, when we, as IFA, we are producing the work that is shown at the German Pavilion every other year, and I had the impression that this year's announcement sparked quite some interest. I mean, with Henrike Naumann and the curator Kathleen Reinhardt, it's a team of 3 women. Then German media or the press have also highlighted that all of these 3, the 2 artists and the curator, have an East German history. And that was something that was noted, even though I don't think that neither one of you looks necessarily at yourself as East German, or, I mean, it's more complex than that. And I've also met people who looked at this East German representation and were really encouraged by it, and there was some really positive reaction. Is that something that you've encountered as well? Or do you see it rather as you are an artist, you're invited because of your rich artistic practice that you've developed through the years?
Yes, I received that feedback as well. I think it comes with the good and the bad. Because of course, when you label it as an East German pavilion, let's say, you can also easily put it into brackets and to sort of say it doesn't belong to the rest of the German pavilions, and I think that would be a problem and a challenge to grow out of that again, because I think it is very much part of German history we're talking about. But of course, people feel very strongly about something like a pavilion and who's doing it, and in that way, we were sort of also very fortunate to have that feedback.
So it's been announced that there's this secrecy to the work that the artists will present at Venice. You're showing work together with Henrike Naumann, who's also an outstanding contemporary German artist. Henrike Naumann was born in 1984. She also lives and works in Berlin. She works with design and interiors and reflects on socio-political problems. She's also shown her work in the US at the Sculpture Center in New York in 2022. And in the press release where you both talked about the work that you're planning for Venice, you said that you make visible the fractures and the tensions between the past, present, and future. So what are you currently working on? What can we expect to see in Venice? Can you tell us a teeny little bit about the thoughts and the work?
I mean, we have sort of mutual discussions, of course, also with Kathleen, my curator, but more about my ongoing work and the ongoing research that I'm doing. And, you know, I think for me, the pavilion is maybe not necessarily a space to show art. I think it's a conflicted space to show art. I think for me, I really think about it more as a contribution, you know, what could be the contribution in this moment in time that relates to the pavilion. And I think, you know, the best projects that have done that have approached it in that way. You know, I think about Hans Hake or, you know, even somebody like Maria Eichhorn. It's very much a project that is specific, you know, for the German pavilion, because of course the German pavilion has a very specific past, you know.
So Hans Hake destroyed the floor of the pavilion. He basically messed it all up. Yeah.
Yeah, he tore the floor apart. And Maria Eichhorn, of course, looks into the history of the German pavilion as initially the Bavarian pavilion, and how then in the 1930s, you know, it was expanded on, you know, during the Nazi era. And so I think for me, you know, to work in that space and within that context is very specific. And I would like to think about the contribution that I make, you know, fitting into that, because I'm also just interested in the structure of it. So, you know, that's the way I want to approach it. I don't think so much about it as a continuation within my work, although, of course, it is. But it's very much, you know, made to work with the conditions that are there.
And the conditions that are there are this history and this place. So the Venice Biennale, if you know, you have the Giardini, this garden, and then you walk up to 3 pavilions, and on the right-hand side is the German pavilion. Are the conditions that you talk about, or also what's going on in the world and how maybe people look at Germany today?
I think, you know, I think artists don't necessarily have the responsibility to answer everything. That's not necessarily where I see myself. I see it very much within the continuation of my work. But of course, yes, you know, the idea of national representation is in many ways outmoded. And, you know, that I'm also doing it at this moment in time has a certain meaning. And so I hope I can contribute in some way, but I don't think it's necessarily only the responsibility of the artist to have all the answers. I think, you know, most importantly for me, it's about continuing my work, but consider, you know, the conditions under which they take place in such a situation.
Speaking about your work and the road to Venice, you know, how did it all start? I know that you also studied politics at one point, and then you decided to study art as well. So how did you become an artist?
So I actually come from theater. I think when I was young, my mother had to work a lot, and I needed something to do. And so I was in amateur theater, child theater, And from there, I, made a detour to study politics. I actually studied politics and administration in Constance, and then moved to study international relations at the Technical University in Dresden, and then broke off, those studies to pursue fine art in Hamburg. And I think for me, I actually, to be honest, I barely ever went to a museum before I started art school. It was more the choice of not exactly knowing what to do. I wanted to do something creative. It was clearly not theater or acting. And art just felt like a space where I could combine different interests. And so I sort of fell into it. And I, for a very long time, didn't think I would become an artist necessarily, because in my bachelor, I barely went to the studio. I mostly just went to see exhibitions and tried to even figure out what I could make work about. And it came only after the studies that I found a bit of a corner where I felt I had something to say, or I had something to contribute.
So I think that your body of work is very diverse. I mean, we see hanging furniture right here. This is part of the KW exhibition, where you also talk about smuggling and cigarettes. And then you have work shown at Haus der Kunst in Munich, which we'll talk about in a second. But I want to ask about the bus tours that you offered in Berlin. There's also some photos included of that. You lead people through Gerensee-Straße, a particular area in Berlin. And the buildings are now derelict, but they are also connected to your history. Can you tell us more about that work? And it will come up in just a few seconds in the slideshow.
Yeah, so in 2023, I started, well, actually it was a friend of mine that I took to Gernsee-Straße. So Gernsee-Straße is the housing complex where I used to live from 1994 to 1997. And it was one of the biggest housing complexes for Vietnamese contract workers in the GDR. And I actually only found out about it much later. But I brought a friend there in 2023, and realized actually how impressive it was to him, that housing complex. And I somehow, in his eyes, saw that there was something here for me. And so after his visit, on the same day, I just made a post on my Instagram where I attached a Google Doc, and I said, well, if anybody's interested in visiting this derelict site, I'm offering tours. But I didn't have any tour planned, and I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I would like to take people there. And that Google Doc filled up very quickly. I realized that people were interested in going there. And I was like, okay, I actually now need to research more thoroughly what this housing complex is about. And so, I went to look more specifically in that history. And of course, I knew it was a housing complex for Vietnamese contract workers. I knew that in the GDR times, there were around 4,000, Vietnamese people living there. And I also knew what it meant in the 90s when my mother and I lived there, where it was the biggest community for the Vietnamese, post the collapse of the GDR, in a very precarious time where, all those contract workers basically lost their permit to work and, worked in informal infrastructures, from, selling flowers to selling cigarettes to trying to cut hair. And me and my mom, as asylum seekers who wanted to reunite with my father, also ending up in the same space just because we could receive, language support, we could receive legal support within the community. And I somehow saw a chance to, reconnect that history with my history, and also to think about Berlin of today and what it means to have, a speculative immobilia site, which is over 6 hectares large, very close to the center, actually. If you take the tram from Alexanderplatz, it's around, 25 minutes to get to Gernseystraße. And so I saw a lot of Berlin history and, German history mirrored in that very personal space where I grew up when I was a child. And I thought it just connected, so many strands of my work. And, I think I'm sort of extremely proud of that project because, I didn't need anything to do it. It was literally just me showing up at a site and bringing people. I didn't need an institution. I didn't need any money. The only thing I needed was my research and people that I could, walk through. And yeah, it just became a very special project to me.
Is it finished or is it an ongoing project? Do you still research that area? And do you also connect it to Rostock-Lichtenhagen, where there was also a building where Vietnamese people lived and that was under heavy attack by right-wing Germans and saw these racist incidents?
Yeah. So I still bring people there. It just became more precarious because they were supposed to be demolished in 2024. And they are still standing. I mean, they've been privatized since actually Germany's reunification. So it's completely private property. And I have, sort of contact with Belle Epoque. This is the name of the current developers. But they don't necessarily want people to visit. I think for one, they're scared of bad press and that I bring bad press. And on the other hand, I think, they would argue that it's dangerous to go there, which it's kind of true, it is. There are a lot of holes. It's a ruin.
And so you booked a bus to take people there, or is this connected to the buses?
Yeah, so the bus was one exceptional project. Usually I would, just meet people at the site and bring people. I
so
usually...
we can Instagram you?
Maybe. Right now it's more difficult. Usually I would get a permit for 10 people and then I would, at its height, I would bring 60 people. And so we had the police come and, escort us out of the site. It was, it was a legal gray zone too. It was trespassing into private property, basically. But I still do it. I still bring people there, but more on a one-on-one basis now because I don't get the permit to bring a larger group. But I still try and do it now and then. It's just more precarious now also because it's a airsoft field where right now, they simulate World War III and shoot each other with airsoft balls. It's sort of like subcontracted to a company that is called Bearsoft. And so, when we go in there now, it's a very different experience than having gone there 2 years ago. So I have to navigate all those different activities that are happening, at the site at the moment.
There's this other work at Haus der Kunst where we see a desk and a chair and forms. This is a work called Zugzwang. Can you tell us more about that work?
So Zugzwang was my first institutional show, and for Zugzwang I basically invented a father that I never had, who was fictionally a bureaucrat based in Brussels called James Stevens. And James Stevens was basically taken from Ishiguro's novel, The Remains of the Day, where you had another James Stevens, who was a butler and serving Lord Darlington. And Lord Darlington was sort of flirting with the Nazis. And I, somehow appropriated that name to turn him into my father, to actually talk about how he just fulfills, the legal... he basically just fulfills his job and follows, the legal guidelines of Brussels and whatever, his boss is telling him. And it's exactly the same character in Ishiguro's novel the butler who just follows, whatever his lord, in this case Darlington, is telling him to do. So he's turning a blind eye on basically the interactions Lord Darlington has with the Nazis. And I try to use that character as my father to complicate that relationship that I have with Germany. And I wanted to inflict Germany, because I think otherwise what I feared in that exhibition at Zugzwang was, that you could very easily define who's an immigrant, who's an expat, who is a refugee. And I wanted to complicate that through a personal relationship with a father that, I personally don't know my father very well, so I decided to somehow fictionalize my father and imagining him. And so you see images of me and my mother, at this fictional desk of my supposed bureaucrat father, to complicate, that relationship of immigration, and what it would mean if I would, come in another form to Germany, which, in reality is not true.
In which form?
In a legal way, through state diplomacy, for instance, maybe in an expat way, in a way where you have legal papers, I have basically a set of 31 documents that are hung along the wall with a title called Alekin's Defense.
Mm-hmm. It's also included in the images.
Yeah, and I go, I basically fictionalized different documents for application for asylum. And I fictionalized them actually on the side of bureaucracy. So the questions that were asked, I enlarged certain circles that you were supposed to tick that didn't make sense, why you would need to tick them. And I drew a chess game on top of it, a chess game from 1926.
So when I researched this, Alekin's Defense is it refers to an opening strategy in chess, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this strategy, or preparing yourself, having a defense strategy, is that also something that you needed to develop in order to deal with, this illegal status that you had? Is this an allegory that you had in mind, or how does this Alekin's Defense play into this fictional world that you created?
Yes, I think, for me, the question of filling in asylum papers is always the question, it's not necessarily about your story. It's about how can you fit that story into that paperwork to get to where you need to go, right? Because, when you, for instance, look at the statistics of those asylum applications, oftentimes they're very traumatic experiences that people go through, and people often don't necessarily make sense all the time. They don't remember clearly what happened. But on the form, you need to make it look like it all made sense. You have to have proof of how that story goes, and you have to fit, of course, the criteria in order to be granted asylum. So for me, that game of chess was an allegory to move through that paperwork.
So now we talked a lot about your personal story, your personal background, how that influenced your work.
Mm-hmm.
You've also shown work in Brooklyn, Infraspector, that was in 2023. And that's a work that looks at fracking. How do you approach, like when you come to a new place, you start researching, how do you approach this new space, and how do you then mold your research into an exhibition, into something that you want to say? And is this maybe the first time that you started to lose or not talk about your own personal history, but look at other topics?
So, in 2020, I opened Haus der Kunst in end of January, And 7 days later, I opened another institutional show at Nottingham Contemporary, 7th of February 2020, that was called In Cold Print. And I knew that those two institutional exhibitions were very close to each other. And I already there decided to have two vastly different bodies of work. So at Nottingham Contemporary, I showed a body of research around Havana syndrome, which is, I mean, we can talk about Havana syndrome at length, but it's, you know, it looks into actually the history of psychological warfare, that the Americans also did, during the war in Vietnam, and how that, in a way, in my interpretation, has backfired and resurfaced at Havana, through Havana syndrome. And that was a very conscious decision to have these vastly sort of different body of research be shown alongside. And even today, I have some, curators approach me for a certain body of work, and they wouldn't necessarily know this other body of work that I do. And I'm kind of completely fine with that. And, it sounds very selfish, but I try and pick and choose how I navigate certain situations, because I think in every situation there's something that can be said and something that maybe cannot be said, because the conditions are not necessarily fruitful for it. For instance, I could show the history of Vietnamese contract workers in America, but I think it's an easy way out for an American audience, because you could say, look, this is very far away from what we know or what is even of our interest, and it doesn't necessarily complicate the situation. And I'm interested in complicating something. I'm interested in making things difficult for my audience, or so I try and think about the context that I work in, and I make works about that. And for Armand, for instance, we tied these two different bodies of works together between Havana syndrome and fracking, because Armand Foundation, when I went to a site visit, had all these open holes on the floor where they were trying to basically connect two different pipelines, the North Brooklyn pipeline to another pipeline, to basically extend the network, energy network in the area. And I thought, oh, there's maybe something here that I can do. And then I basically approached it very much from the perspective of data. So I actually looked at fracking data, because I'm interested in certain bureaucracies of data collection, and I thought maybe there's a little gap here where I can contribute. And then I went on a journey with Gary Allison, a data scientist, to actually research the different chemicals involved in fracking. And we went through a public database called Frack Focus, that has around 5 million entries of all the different chemicals that are involved in fracking. And we actually cleaned up, the data for it to then extract the information. And then the exhibition became about that.
Sung Tieu, thank you very much for the insight in your different bodies of work. I think this was an incredibly rich delving into your different perspectives, and I heard that you said that you like to complicate things, so maybe we're looking forward to Venice and some complicated, difficult history. In any case, I invite you all very warmly to join us in May at the Venice Biennale. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gitte, thank you, Sung Tieu.